Nature lied to you about oysters. Here's the proof. In a 6-year study, researchers tagged and tracked nearly 7,500 individual oysters. 58% of them changed sex at least once. Some changed twice. A few changed 5 times. That oyster on your dinner plate? It might have been born male, lived as a female, and switched back again multiple times before it ever reached your fork. You've spent your whole life sorting animals into 2 fixed boxes. Oysters never agreed to that rule. Here's the number that should stop you. In that same study, up to 34% of oysters changed sex between just their first 2 breeding seasons, not over a lifetime. In one single year-to-year jump. You've been taught that sex is something an animal is born with and keeps a fixed trait, like eye color. That rule holds for you. It doesn't hold for the animals sitting in the seafood case at your grocery store. And it's not a fringe case in one weird species. Researchers have documented this same sex-switching pattern in Pacific oysters, European flat oysters, pearl oysters, and more. If you've eaten an oyster, there's a real chance you ate an animal that had already lived as both sexes. Here's the part that really lands. Scientists still don't fully understand what triggers it. Size, stress, food availability, even water chemistry all appear to play a role, and researchers are still working out exactly how. This isn't a fringe claim. It comes from a 2020 study published in the journal Aquaculture, led by researcher Lionel Degremont and colleagues at the French research institute IFREMER. They individually tagged and tracked thousands of oysters for 6 straight years, the largest study of its kind. This is published, peer-reviewed science. Here's the real number. In that 6-year study, of the 1,386 oysters tracked for the full duration, 58% were what scientists call sequential hermaphrodites, meaning they change sex at least once. Only 42% never changed at all. Think about what that means. If you picked 10 oysters at random off a reef, statistically, more than half of them are going to switch sex at some point in their life. That's not an outlier. That's the majority. The next time someone says an animal's sex is always a fixed, unchanging trait, you now have a documented counterexample involving one of the most commonly eaten animals on the planet. But knowing it happens is one thing. Knowing why is where this gets genuinely strange. Most oysters follow a pattern called protandry. They start life as males, then switch to female later. Here's why that makes biological sense. Producing sperm costs an oyster very little energy. Producing eggs costs a lot more. A small young oyster doesn't have the energy reserves to produce eggs efficiently, so it starts as a cheap-to-run male. As it grows larger and stores more energy, switching to female lets it produce dramatically more offspring per reproductive cycle. In the study, researchers found the switch wasn't just one-directional. Either 19% went from male to female, but 13% actually went the other way, from female back to male. Sex, for an oyster, isn't identity. It's a resource allocation decision the animal's body makes automatically, based on energy and growth. So, if this is a smart biological strategy, what happens when you throw the ocean itself off balance? That's where the story turns. A separate study on Sydney rock oysters found that ocean acidification, the ongoing drop in ocean pH driven by rising carbon dioxide, altered sex determination in the population. After just one reproductive cycle under acidified conditions, researchers recorded 16% more females than males compared to normal conditions. Here's why that number matters more than it sounds. Oyster reproduction depends on males and females being in reasonable balance to successfully fertilize eggs in open water. Skew that ratio too far, and you start reducing how many new oysters get produced at all, which affects the entire reef ecosystem those oysters support, including fish nurseries and coastal water filtration. This isn't just a quirky biology fact. It's a live indicator of how ocean chemistry is already reshaping marine life at a fundamental, reproductive level. That leads to the question most people never think to ask about the oyster on their plate. Unlike most animals, oysters show no external sign of their sex. Researchers can only determine it by taking a tissue sample and looking at the gonad under a microscope. There's no visual, behavioral, or shell-based way to tell. It is less than hazon. Jinghao dayur. This means every single raw oyster on a restaurant platter is, quite literally, a coin flip. And that coin flip might resolve differently than it would have a year earlier or a year later for that exact same animal. The male and female oyster distinction, which sounds so definitive, is actually one of the least stable sex classifications in the entire animal kingdom. Here's what to actually do with everything you've just learned. You don't need to become a marine biologist to use this. Next time you're at a raw bar or you see a headline about declining oyster populations, you now understand something most people, including a lot of chefs, genuinely don't know. The sex ratio of that population isn't fixed, and it's directly sensitive to changing ocean conditions. In one sentence, oyster sex isn't a fact about the animal. It's a snapshot of that animal's current environment and energy state, subject to change. That single reframe sex as a snapshot, not a label, is the difference between a fun trivia fact and actually understanding how these animals work. So think back to that number, 58% of oysters changing sex at least once, some as many as 5 times. It wasn't a glitch. It was biology solving a resource problem in real time, and it's still happening, right now, in every oyster bed on the planet, shifting slightly as the ocean itself changes around them. Here's your one action. Next time you eat or see an oyster, remember, it's not a male or a female. It's an animal mid-decision. If nature lied to you again today, subscribe, because this channel exists to catch it every time.